Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, February 3rd, 2020. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and thank you for starting your week off with a little time with me today. I really appreciate you being here with me. Now, if you're like me at all, you've probably noticed that no matter what the issue, you're going to have either Democrats or Republicans, or in some cases both, living in absolute fear about how dangerous things are on that particular issue and how more government, more centralization of power is really needed to supposedly fix things or make things less scary. Today, I'm going to give some examples of that. I'm going to talk about why this is the case, what we were warned about, and then, of course, some more important and very timeless warnings from the founders about growing and centralizing power as a so-called solution to fix problems. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in DTLA for the 10th Amendment Center. We have a bunch of live streaming video channels: YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, DLive, and Twitch, plus archived video versions at Brighteon.com, BitChute.com, BitTube.tv. And then we also have the audio-only podcast editions over on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and elsewhere, Google, I believe. You can find all of those platforms, all the ways to follow us, the ways to support us, like our membership program for as little as $2 a month. We make that go a long, long way. Find all of that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where you get all the info on the show and all the platforms and all the archives and all the show notes that I talk about in each episode. And I will include, I've got a number of links to include in this episode. I usually have those published anywhere from about a half hour to an hour after the live broadcast is over. That's really for you who are joining me live, and I really appreciate that. For those of you visiting it from the archives later on, they will always be there right when you're listening or watching, of course. And speaking of the live broadcast, let's say hello to everyone out on the live chat. I appreciate everyone that I can at least notice and mention. There's a screen that's in front of me on this app from Restream that kind of just blasts by as everyone leaves comments, and I'm so grateful for that. So hello to Essential Freedom. I'm glad you're doing better. I know you were sick, so glad you're back and alive. Melody Skaman, Ward Lawrence, Andrew Nappy, Kerry Norris, Tyler B., Shane Lackey, Clay Davis, Richard Kramer, Dan Reed, Pete Hodgkins, Penny Barnard, and everyone, Chris Reagan, or Regan, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sure I've asked that before. Sherry Voluntary, good to see you, buddy. R.C. Andrews, Suzanne Sperry, and Brendan Bryark. Everyone else, I apologize if I missed you. Continue leaving me comments, whether it's live or in the archives. I do read through them. Sometimes, depending on how long I blab on during the shows, I will go back and scroll through and answer some questions. A little heads up, it is very likely that I will take the day off and not do a live episode or an episode at all this Wednesday. That is what, the 5th? I just have a lot of stuff on my plate, and if I can fit in doing the episode, I absolutely will, but I got to get caught up on a few other things. Otherwise, I will be back Friday morning one way or the other. Anyways, let's get to this. And hi to Austrian Watchmen out on YouTube as well. I appreciate it. You know, I've often been told, and I used to start out a lot of speeches like this, basically, if you're not pissing anyone off ever who's listening to you, you're really doing a bad job because you're never challenging people's general mode of thought. And living under the largest government in the history of the world, the largest empire the world has ever seen, and it's not even close, if you're never challenging the mode of thought of the people who listen or hear you or watch you, then you're really failing. And I know I've challenged a few of you out there. I've gotten some feedback saying, hey, Bolden, you've really missed the mark on this one. And maybe I did, but at least we're talking about these issues. And there's this article from a guy who I've been reading for a long, long time over at Future of Freedom Foundation. It's fff.org. If you've watched the show for quite a while or listened to it, you've heard me reference Jacob Hornberger. He is a presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party, but outside of that, he's done a ton of great work for a long time in support of the Constitution, decentralization, and for liberty. And he had this article back in December, I believe, called A Powerful Government Equals a Weak Nation. And I think Jacob does a pretty good job of irritating people from all across the spectrum with little pieces throughout this. And I want to go through this article a bit and cut back and forth. There's so many good parts of it. I want to read some pieces to it, just some short paragraphs, and then cut back and forth to some thoughts of the founders. And I want to wrap it up with a bunch of different warnings, as I mentioned at the outset here. So let's start it out here with what Jacob has to say. He starts out his article with this: "It is supremely ironic that the United States has the most powerful government in history, and at the same time, the most frightened people in the world." Now, of course, we know that the federal government was not supposed to be the most powerful government in history. The founders, the revolutionaries, the people who ratified, the people of the several states, they fought a long, bloody war to get away from the most powerful government in history at that time. There's no way they wanted to do that just to create another version of the same and much worse. And here's James Madison, who famously said it this way in Federalist 45. Now, the Federalist Papers were not really widely read at the time of the ratification debates. This was primarily for an audience in the New York ratifying convention, but it still certainly applies coming from Madison. He said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the new federal government are, quote, few and defined. No government of few and defined powers should ever rise to be the most powerful government in the history of the world. Now, Hornberger goes on with this. He says, many Americans are scared of everything. And I'm sure we're going to come up with something on the list that might have you kind of reject the idea that maybe Jacob's an idiot, but whatever. He says, many Americans are scared of everything. Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, Muslims, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the terrorists, the drug dealers, the illegal immigrants, the communists, ISIS, Syria. Such Americans are convinced that every scary creature in the world is coming to get them. Now, I think most people are afraid of some or one. Very few people are frightened of all of these. But as a result, people they take one issue that they think is very dangerous to the country, dangerous to their political ideology, dangerous to their liberty, whatever it may be. And the solution always seems to be to call, maybe not for you and me, but the solution for most people in the general public is to have the federal government come in and fix things. I went to a government-run school, a propaganda institution, and I learned, well, first I started out at a Catholic school for the first 8 years of my education, and I learned that all solutions came through the Catholic Church. Whether you agree or not with that is not the point, but that's what you're going to get in a Catholic school. I got the same thing when I got to the government school, but for a different reason. I learned going through government-run schools that the solution to every problem was government. Government was the savior of everything. It was hard to actually kind of get past the idea that government could be the bad guys in America, because we were taught that everybody else is the bad guys and the U.S. government was fighting for freedom. So I think Jacob is really onto something here. You'll probably disagree with one of the two things, or maybe most of them, that he's talking about that people are afraid of, but certainly there's a lot of fear going on here. And of course, we were warned about fear. John Adams, back when he was really good, back in 1776, he put it this way: fear is the foundation of most governments. The foundation. They thrive and they live off of fear. They grow from fear. And fear leads to more and more power. He puts it this way: it is so sordid and brutal a passion, and renders men in whose breast it predominates so stupid and miserable. He's totally spot on with that. But unfortunately, well, maybe at the time he was right. He said Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution which is founded on it. And maybe the people at the time were not interested in an institution founded on fear. Certainly these days, almost everything is founded on fear. Jacob goes a little further. He says, sadly, this is how we have lost our liberties in the country. Frightened over so many scary creatures in the world, many Americans agreed to trade our liberties away to the federal government in the hope of being kept safe and secure. And if you're watching along, I'm sure you can guess where I'm going, what the next quote is going to be. We can go to the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin. It first came out in 1755, and I know some people who love the national security state, like Benjamin Witz, this lawyer guy who is almost wrong on almost everything in my mind, but who loves the national security state. But he points out that the quote was not applied how most people try to apply it today originally in 1755, But Ben Franklin did use it again in 1775, and it's very straightforward. He says, they who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So we have been scared, and the founders generally understood this. I think the people at the time generally understood this, that government or situations, people were going to be scared, and in times of fear where people had perceived danger, they would go to government and say, well, just for this emergency situation or for this particular issue, because we're afraid of the outcome, we want you to have power to protect us. But Franklin warned us as well that when you do that, you're going to get, and you deserve neither liberty nor safety. It's my view that you can only be safe when you're free. Going further, back to Hornberger's article, which is really good. He says this phenomenon is not a coincidence. That's what omnipotent government does. And again, we know that the founders have been told us this over 2 centuries ago. The only reason maybe we didn't learn this, I know in my situation, I didn't learn it because I went to a government school that certainly didn't want to teach me that government would use fear to expand its own power. So I wasn't taught these things. Hornberger goes on. He says it produces a weak nation, one consisting of citizens who are deathly afraid of everything, are convinced that every boogeyman in the world is coming to get them, and are hopelessly dependent on the government's welfare narcotic. So you're afraid of millions of people dying in the streets, terrorists coming to kill you, the mullahs in Iran, whatever it may be. Human beings having a natural right to defend themselves, people living in privacy without having to share everything with the government. People are afraid of all these things, and they're telling us if you don't allow government to have that power, people are going to die in the streets, whether from terrorism or lack of health insurance plans or whatever it may be. And this is what government does. Absolutely. It's not a coincidence at all. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, told us as well, the essence of government is power. And power, lodged as it must be in human hands, will ever be liable to abuse. So every time you call for government power, every time people demand more power to fix something, they're also authorizing someone in the future to use that power in totally different ways or against you. So I often point out that the people on the left are absolutely insane these days. I mean, the left and right, and these are really bad terms, left and right, but the average Democrat is completely nuts, not in the fact that they complain about the current administration. I mean, this is, again, it's a huge government with a $23 trillion debt, national debt, and growing. We're not even talking about unfunded liabilities. There's more surveillance, more gun control, all kinds of stuff. There are all kinds of problems to be concerned about. Where the left is insane, and I think the same thing would happen, I could say the same thing about the right when the left is in charge or Democrats are in charge, is that they're only concerned about it now. They weren't concerned about it when their guy was doing the exact same thing a few years ago. And even worse, instead of recognizing the problem, instead of seeing the current administration as an anomaly. They think it's just an anomaly. It's a one-time thing. And their solution to every problem is to give the institution run by the person they consider to be the most dangerous human being on earth more power. Let's say he gets voted out and their guy comes in or their girl comes in and runs the show, and it runs the show exactly the way they want it. Do they think that only their team will always be in power and there's never going to be opposition in the future? To me, this is the most idiotic approach, because whether you're left or right, the only way to accomplish what you want is to decentralize. That's kind of a side note there, but Madison warned us that the essence of government is power, and it's always going to be liable to abuse. And Hornberger summed this up as well in his article. The government, of course, takes advantage of the widespread fear among the citizenry by seizing even more power over people's lives. It sounds just like what John Adams, just what James Madison had to say. Going on, he says, scared to death, especially during a crisis, people become more willing, even eager to surrender their freedom to their own government in order to be kept safe and secure. I would argue that they don't even get that. including from dangers that the government itself produces with its policies. Most of the problems that we face are caused by government anyways. Government getting in the way, government manipulating markets, government destroying the economy, government creating enemies abroad all the time. So government is causing most of the problems. So going to the government, which created the problem in the first place, to fix the problem isn't just bad strategy. It's dangerous, it's stupid, and it shouldn't be done. And Madison put it this way: perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. So he knew then that conspiracy theories, I mean, we can be conspiracy about this, but he knew then that if government didn't find the people sufficiently frightened to give up their liberty, government as an institution would just make crap up in order to scare people to gain more power for itself. That's what Madison called a universal truth. And if he recognized that hundreds of years ago, it should be even more obvious to us today. Now, we were warned about this. We were warned that what was called consolidation of power, all the founders were concerned about consolidation of power. They were all seeing it as a problem. And even those who didn't actually consider the founding document, the Constitution, as one of centralization of power, they still acknowledged that consolidation was a problem. Let me go through this a little bit with you and share some quotes. Here, first of all, I think the most important one, or the one to set the foundation, comes from Thomas Jefferson. This is an 1816 letter to Joseph C. Cabell, or Cabell. I'm not sure how you pronounce this. I can't ask either of them, obviously. Jefferson put it this way: what has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating of all cares and powers into one body. So the more that one government makes all the decisions for people, what they can do, what they can't do, what they can eat, what they can't eat, what they can grow, what they can grow, how they can defend themselves, how they can't, how big their toilet can be, what kind of light bulb they can have. We can go through the list of so many thousands and thousands of laws on the books and tens of thousands of regulations in Washington, D.C. that talk about basically everything in your day-to-day lives. This is, even if it's not all decisions made in Washington, D.C., the more that you get in that direction, it isn't just point one, none versus all, but the more that you get centralized, the more that you concentrate all cares and powers into one body, the more that liberty is destroyed. And we are pretty darn close to that today if we're not already there. Richard Henry Lee put it the same way. He said it must not, and this was a letter to Patrick Henry in 1789, it must never be forgotten that the liberties of the people are not so safe under the gracious manner of government as by the limitation of power. Now, that's not making the claim that documents, words on paper, or constitutions can enforce themselves, but certainly if their power is not checked, and you're just hoping, and you may have heard me talk about Patrick Henry, people who actually trust government rulers to be good and do the right thing, they will always lose their liberty. And Richard Henry Lee may have not been as aggressive in that statement, but it's very similar. He's basically saying if you are trusting the people of government to do the right thing, that is not going to keep liberty safe very long at all. And that's Richard Henry Lee, again, in a letter to his friend Patrick Henry. Abigail Adams, in a letter to her husband. And this one, I had to read through it a couple of times. This is from an older article from Mike Meharry. It's titled, "It's Time to Break Up the Government Monopoly," from about 2.5, 3 years ago in 2017. This is a letter that she wrote to her husband in 1775. She says, "The great fish swallow up the small. So the larger the power, the less that the individual even matters. And he who is most strenuous for the rights of the people when vested with power is as eager after the prerogatives of government." So this is the same old message that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, from Lord Acton. Many others, Samuel Adams, talked about this. And here from Abigail Adams, she's also talking about the fact that even people who are on the side of liberty, and maybe this was a warning to her husband. I should read that whole letter at some point soon. I have not read that. in its entirety. But maybe it's a warning to her husband, recognizing that when people get power, even if you're the good guy at one point, as soon as you get that power, you're going to make mistakes, or you're likely to demand more power for yourself. No one with power should ever be trusted. Patrick Henry himself many times talked about consolidation. Here he is in the Virginia Ratification Convention. He called consolidation. Mind you, consolidation is centralization of power as we understand it today. He says a consolidation is as the people have considered a consolidation as the greatest of evils. Centralization of power is the greatest of evil, according to Patrick Henry. Of course, other people thought other things were greater evils. John Adams thought the division of the country into two ruling parties. James Madison, for example, thought that war was the greatest threat to liberty. But Patrick Henry thought centralization of power was the greatest of evils. William Grayson, also, this is not somebody that a lot of people hear about. This was also in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said the idea of consolidation is abhorrent to the people of this country. Now, mind you, again, as I was mentioning, not everybody thought, this was during the ratification debates, not everybody was warning about consolidation. Like Grayson, like Henry, like Richard Henry Lee, like Jefferson and others. They weren't all warning about it. Tench Coxe, and I don't have the letter handy, but he wrote to George Washington basically talking about the fact that, these antis, the anti-federalists as they called them, it was a term of art, they're all up in arms about consolidation. Here we are hearing about consolidation, but this is absurd. We obviously aren't trying to consolidate in the way that they're talking about. And even if you disagree or agree with them, they both, Washington and Coxe, both recognized, this Coxe was from Pennsylvania, they recognized that consolidation was bad. They just thought that their opposition was using the term as fear-mongering. So they all recognized it as a serious problem. Patrick Henry again, he put it this way, also in that same speech, I believe. He said, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. The more centralization you get, you will always lose your liberty. Here's Fisher Ames in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, who at that time, he was arguing in favor of a proposed amendment that was going to go on their ratification document, basically the precursor to what is the 10th Amendment, that the federal government is only one of delegated powers and everything else is reserved to the states or to the people. And he said a consolidation of the states would subvert the new Constitution, and against which this article is our best security. He said that, this is the way to actually make it clear, this 10th Amendment. He said, too much provision cannot be made against consolidation. You can't go too far to prevent centralization of power. The state governments represent the wishes and feelings and the local interests of the people. They are the safeguard and ornament of the Constitution. They will protect blah, blah, blah. They will afford shelter against abuse of power and be the natural avengers of our violated rights. But now they act primarily as mere corporations or subdivisions or counties of the federal government because all the decisions are tied to funding and it's basically centralization of power. But without getting into too much detail of how this is played out, Ames was also on board in Massachusetts talking about how you can't do too much to try to prevent consolidation because it is so dangerous. And here's Benjamin Lincoln in a letter to John Adams. This is also 1789. He was recommending rejecting the Constitution at the time. He says, anything which looks national or like a consolidation of the different states is thought to be one of the greatest evils which can befall us and to be avoided as such. Across the board, even John Adams, I would say, was against the idea of consolidation. He just was against the idea that what was going to be created. Maybe he was wrong, but they were all against centralization of power. And I think the best way to sum it up is here with Thomas Jefferson. This is an 1800 letter to Gideon Granger. He says, our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government. No kidding. Why is Washington, D.C. so concerned with how much water your toilet has, or what plant I grow in my backyard, or how you and I choose to defend ourselves, our property, our family, how big our street sign should be? Basically, anything and everything is a federal concern. And we just posted on our stories this morning A quick one or a quick update from Mike Meharry talking about a recent proposal from Bernie Sanders, not to kind of just jump the shark here and get into that whole debate, but Bernie's talking about, at least from my understanding, forcing a legalization of cannabis on the entire country. Now, that's not, the federal government should have no say pro or con. And then once you allow that guy to make that decision for the entire country, you're also giving the next person who opposes it the same power to do the opposite, and you're creating this precedent. The only thing that the federal government should do on cannabis and just about everything else is get the hell out of the way. Jefferson goes on. He says, public servants at such a distance and from under the eye of their constituents will, from the circumstance of distance, because they're so far away, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizen. Now, maybe that's redundant or an oxymoron, good government. And the same circumstance, by rendering detection impossible to their constituents, will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. And I think we have a trifecta of corruption, plunder, and waste, whether it's from Democrats or Republicans, at basically every level of government. I want to say hi again to the live chat. Sherry Voluntary says centralization is the greatest evil, even over war, because the war machine grows in relation to the size of government. I don't know. I'm sure we could have a debate about that. I tend to think war is right up there. Basically, all of them lead to more power. So, yeah, I mean, but it is all very dangerous. Josh Irwin says, do you guys offer a book or author or suggest either that covers these topics in similar ways that you do? We have a number of books that we think are very good, maybe not on this exact topic, but a number of really good books on our website at shop.10thamendmentcenter.com. When you go to that website, Josh, you'll primarily see advertisements to sign up for our membership program, but just click the links for books. You're going to find tons of stuff from my buddy Mike Meharry. If you listen to the Tom Woods Show podcast, or if you don't, you should. If you do and you're not caught up on it yet, he just interviewed Mike about his new book, Constitution Owner's Manual. We're not carrying that here yet, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll have Mike's book up. He kind of surprised me. I didn't realize it was going to be published. He said, I got it done, so I'm going to release it. And Woods was kind enough to interview him about that. But I've been reading Mike's work. He's going to talk about that quite a bit, but we've got a lot of books on the website that will talk about this in more detail. And then I'm also going to link to a lot of these articles in our show notes as well. Robert Reyes says, love my country, ashamed of my government. That's a good way to put it, because loyalty to one's country, patriotism, whatever word we may use, does not mean you have to love the operation of the government. Choosing the lesser of two evils, if that is your approach in voting, for example, does not mean you actually have to support the person. Although the late, great Harry Brown, some years ago, who I learned so much from, he often would say, look, the person that you're voting for doesn't see your vote as, well, hey, Mr. Candidate, you're just less bad. They see it as an endorsement of all the things that they're proposing, so you might want to keep that in mind as well. Robert Rayer also says, read 3 Felonies a Day. This is a book that I mentioned recently on an episode about obedience and the founder's view on resistance and disobedience, civil disobedience to government so-called laws. That is actually a good idea as well. Essential Freedom said he listened to that interview between Meharry and Woods. I think Meharry did awesome on that. And Tom just kept basically saying, like, this is basically the best short overview introduction to the constitutional structure. And when Tom says that, I think we should definitely listen. Austrian Watchman also recommends from Woods Nullification, his great book from a number of years ago. Ward Lawrence, this is a good point, where when people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. I think that might be one of these that shows up from one founder, but it really is supposed to be from somebody else. It doesn't matter who said that one, but that is an actually incredible statement as well. Clint Vick says state and local government weren't given the power to make those calls either. And I think in many situations, most of the issues that we're talking about, if the government violates your rights on a state level, absolutely, they're still violating your right. But asking the most powerful government in the history of the world to protect you from an extremely powerful but less one on a state level, I think is just dangerous strategy. I don't want to go to Al Capone to protect me from Lucky Luciano. And that's basically how I see going to the federal government to protect me from California. I live in California. Most of you I know do not. So I know there's some of you out there who do live in California like me. We make these choices. Maybe like me, you like your tyranny warm. But I don't want Washington, D.C. marching their troops in, whether it's some kind of agency agents or their lawsuits or whatever. I don't want to be protected by Washington, D.C. because Washington, D.C. is the most dangerous, the largest government in history. That is not safety in my mind. But I agree, Clint, absolutely. Most of what happens on a state and local government, local level, shouldn't be happening either. But I think too many people are actually looking to another more dangerous government to protect them rather than coming up with other solutions. He Hate Me cited this great quote from Patrick Henry that I've covered many, many times here, but it's worth repeating. Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you give them power and you just trust them to do the right thing, in the long run, even if they do things that you like today, you will always have your liberty lost. Scrolling a little bit further, Sherry Voluntary recommends reading over at Mises.org. She says, go to Mises.org and just start reading. We can also recommend 10thamendmentcenter.com. I read Mises. I read antiwar.com. I read Future of Freedom Foundation. I read all kinds of stuff. Maybe I should do a reading list of my day-to-day websites. I have tons of stuff that isn't in line with what we do either because I want to know what the opposition is. The more and more, I had a friend of mine who was studying for the bar here in Los Angeles. She now lives in Germany. I forget where she lives now. But we were out on a run together with a running group that I've been part of here. Stopped because I injured myself. But side note, we were talking about things. And I read a lot of these law review, these long 40, 50-page white papers on things. And I was basically saying somehow it came up that I'm not reading a lot from people that vehemently disagree with how I see things under the Constitution or how the founders did. And she's like, Michael, this is stupid. I would think far better of you, actually. She really, really just punched me in the face, basically. She's like, you should spend almost all your time, once you know where you're coming from, you should spend more time reading your opposition so you can be better prepared to defeat them. And I guess that was maybe the lawyer mentality. So I've been trying to do that more and more, watching my opponents, my enemies, for lack of another word, learning from their strategy, learning from their approach, because that's so incredibly important. Sherry Voluntary says, I need your list in my life. Yeah, I think I do too. R.C. Andrews, freedom means freedom from the government. And the essence of that freedom is the proper limitation of it, not the excess of it. Awesome. Awesome. That is so well said. Essential Freedom says, Missouri is much less tyranny, but we get all 4 seasons in one day, without a doubt. But, you know, that is no joke, though. I mean, I think we can grade things on a curve. I don't really like doing that. I personally think, depending on the issue, every state in the country is a tyranny. They all suck. There isn't really a safe harbor. There isn't a safe place. All the governors are bad. Most of the politicians, even the ones that are right on one thing, are bad on other things. And of course, even if they seem to be good on everything, we've been told by the founders over and over and over, don't trust any of them. It isn't trust but verify. It is verify and verify. And that's really the only way. The mob is another way of putting it as well. That's from Essential Freedom. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. If you have more questions or if I skipped over them, I will be scrolling through the comments a little bit later today. I'll do my best to answer some as I'm able to. Feel free to email me over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. If you enjoy the show, smash that like button, because doing so tells the platform, tells the algorithm, it triggers it a little bit into showing the program to more people. So leaving comments, sharing, smashing a like button, subscribing, all that stuff really helps, and it's free. If you really want to pitch in a couple of bucks a month, $2 and up per month, it's pretty cheap, really can help us do a lot here. When hundreds of people pitch in, it would mean a lot to me. If you're not already a member, I see a lot of you out there who are, but if you're not, if you would consider it, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, it is very likely, unless I get caught up with a bunch of things, it is very likely I will not be doing a show on Wednesday. Either way, I will see you next time here on the Path to Liberty, and I'm very grateful for you spending a little time with me today. Have an awesome Monday.